Well, welcome everyone. I'm the director of the Maplewood Library. We started the Maplewood Ideas Festival in 2014 to celebrate the talent, vision, and creativity of our community. And tonight is an honor to welcome tech policy researcher and writer Tim Hwang to our Ideas Festival stage in conversation with author and journalist Jon Gertner. Introduced to me a couple of years ago by Alberto Ibargüen, a Columbia High School graduate and the president of the Knight Foundation. Alberto said of Tim that he was one of the most creative minds he's ever met. So he's a perfect fit for the Ideas Festival, and we're lucky to call him a Maplewoodian. This has been an inspiring festival with 4 great events so far. We hope you'll come back to the Woodland tomorrow night at 7 p.m. and join us for Nancy Solomon of WNYC in conversation with Deborah Goldstein. Nancy will be receiving the Carol Buchanan Award. And we finish up the festival with 2 events at the Town Hall. On Thursday at 7 p.m., award-winning author Ibby Zaboy will receive the 2022 Maplewood Literary Award and will be in conversation with Jane Folger, our head of youth services. And on Friday at 3:30 at Town Hall, we welcome Mandy Gonzalez, Broadway actor and author and star of Hamilton, for a family-friendly event to close out the festival. As most of you know, the main library is closed for construction, and we hope to be breaking ground very soon. In the meantime, please visit us at the Hilton Branch Library for Children's and Teen Services and 129 Boyden for Adult Services. Thank you to the New Jersey Council for the Arts, the Friends of the Maplewood Library, the Maplewood Library Foundation, the Women's Club of Maplewood, Words Bookstore, and the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for sponsoring our festival this year. And thank you to the staff of the Maplewood Library for making this all possible. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jon Gertner. Jon is the author of The Idea Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Innovation, and The Ice at the End of the World, an epic journey into Greenland's buried past and our perilous future. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and the Washington Post, and a friend of the library who's done at least a couple events for us over the years. And so I turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. And thank you guys for coming, and whoever is on there streaming and listening to us. It's a pleasure to introduce Tim Hwang to everybody. I'm just going to give a quick bio so we can you guys can get to know him a little better. Tim, from your website, is a writer and researcher. He's currently the general counsel at Substack, which is the media company that publishes a lot of interesting writers and writing at the moment. He's also a new resident of Maplewood and a new parent with a 4-month-old. So if he's a little tired, that might explain things. He's the author of this book, which is really interesting, especially if you're involved in any way, shape, or form with advertising or the internet, called Subprime Attention Crisis. And he's a research fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown. He's done this other amazing range of work, which includes serving as the director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative. Did I get that right?
That's right.
That's right, okay. A philanthropic fund and research effort that works to advance the development of machine learning in the public interest. He was also the public policy lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google. In the past, he's also done stints with the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, Tumblr, Mozilla, RAND, Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, and all these others. So I think what's great is that Tim has an understanding of technology and the law, as well as I think a keen appreciation for what technology can do. And I think that distinction is actually kind of crucial. A lot of times, as a writer of innovation, a lot of times when we talk about innovation, or when most of us think about innovation, we think about gadgets or big ideas. But we maybe think a little bit less about what those gadgets or new technologies can actually mean in a larger sense. And what I think I'm talking about are jobs and opportunity, engagement, democratic participation maybe, social justice, all sorts of things. And of course, the flip side of that, I think, is that innovation gone wrong can do the opposite of all those things. And it can, as we've seen with misinformation on the internet or some other sort of worse things, we know that innovation is and technology itself is a kind of two-sided coin. So I told Tim I think I have the responsibility to ask him at some point about Twitter and Elon Musk.
Sure, yeah, I know we're going to get into that. So.
But I think I'll just keep it. Can I just keep that till later?
Sure,
that'll be
that'll be the
okay.
that'll be a twist ending.
Yes, so I'll get people to stay until the end. That's kind of like what you can do.
Sure.
I actually was on Twitter today, and it was actually people on Twitter talking about Twitter.
Yeah.
So it was actually worse than it usually is.
It was like a meta Twitter experience.
Yes, it was.
Right.
Really. So I'm going to just start by asking a really general question, and we're going to talk almost exclusively about innovation in all sorts of different forms. Tim and I had a Zoom last week, and we were chatting, and we seem to agree that innovation's become this sort of monumental sort of social and political mantra. And everyone wants it. Everyone seems to agree that it's incredibly important. It's the key to the future. So maybe we can just set the table and talk a little bit about this buzzy word and talk a little bit about, like, how did we get to this point? I mean, were we talking about innovation the same way in the 80s and 90s, or even in those years preceding the 2010s, sort of? Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really obsessed with is kind of the idea that what we mean by innovation has sort of evolved over time, right? It's been this thing that, I think we've found desirable since the Enlightenment, right, for, a few hundred years now.
Right.
But what we think of when we think of innovation has meant very different things at different times, right? Innovation can happen as part of a government-sponsored project, right? The Manhattan Project was as a form of innovation. It can happen in the context of a big company that's a monopoly, right? Like Bell Labs, right? That's another form of innovation. And I think what's really interesting is the kind of current sort of flavor of innovation that really dominates the discourse today is a very specific thing that I think is driven by the sort of outsized successes of Silicon Valley, basically, I would say, in the last 30, 40 years. And I think I was describing it to you on the phone. It's in some ways like a cargo cult, where we're basically like, wow, this Google thing, this Facebook thing was so successful. Like, maybe it can work for all sorts of things, right? Like, maybe this template of innovation is something that can be broadly applied.
And you want to define cargo cult or jog our memories of what a
sure. So cargo cult is, I think it's an anecdotal story. It's not a real one, right?
No, I think
it is actually a real story.
There are these real tribes.
So it refers to the idea that it refers to kind of this anthropological story about sort of island tribes that observe sort of planes flying overhead and believe that they're gods, right? And they develop a whole religion based around the planes flying overhead
and delivering goods, I think.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And it turns out that Silicon Valley, San Francisco is full of cargo cults, right? So there's a lot of obsession with being in the suburban home where Facebook was founded, because almost in a relic kind of way, if you're there, some of that success may rub off on you, right? And I think this is the kind of innovation that we're talking about when we talk about innovation today. It's technological by and large, right? It's extremely high speed, and it's largely done on the auspices of private companies. Mm-hmm. But it's worth taking a step back and being like, actually, innovation doesn't necessarily need to look like that, right? We can think about innovation which is not technological, right? Which can come from inventing new processes, right? Like legal innovation is actually a form of innovation. Mm-hmm. It could be not high speed, right? We could say, actually, innovation is supposed to take place incrementally over decades, right? But that kind of paradigm has dropped away. I think a final one is also, innovation could happen under the auspices of public institutions, right? But I think that has also dropped away as this kind of cargo cult of what happened in the Valley, in the 80s and 90s, really has kind of reshaped their whole thinking of what we mean when we say innovation. Right. So, and maybe a couple thoughts to kind of get us started.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of just those Apple conferences, or the annual unveiling of what it might be, which is this sort of ultimate sort of, here's this new product that's going to change your life, which has become a kind of institution now. It's interesting. I mean, Bell Labs and sort of those big industrial labs of the 40s and 50s and 60s, I mean, innovation really, innovations is a Connecticut engineer who really believed that you could, do you know?
Innovation, it's like a bunch of 20-somethings doing a software startup in a garage, but it actually turns out that that is also arguably a form of innovation, one which has clearly saved lives, right?
Yeah, no, I think so. So has our kind of fascination with technology then ceded too much ground, too much responsibility in some ways to these tech companies? Are our expectations making us complacent, say, where we expect this kind of innovation, if that's sort of how we've gotten used to it, being out of garages or out of big tech companies, rather than from government or from philanthropies or from other companies?
Yeah, I think we're in a really interesting place. You mentioned earlier that I had worked in public policy at Google. What that means basically is you go in front of like senators and you're like, Senator, there's no problem with our AI. Don't worry about it. It's totally safe, right? And I think one of the really intriguing things that we're in right now is that I think there was a period in the 2000s where a lot of tech companies had kind of captured sort of like the public narrative. Right? It was like to be with Google was to be with the open internet and all the great things that would imply, right? I think we're a long way off from that world right now. But I think what's interesting is that, as a civil society, right, or even as a government, there's actually not a whole lot of consensus into like what should come next. And so I had this very kind of odd conversation with someone who still is in that public policy world, representing one of the big tech companies, which I'll decline to name. And he was like, yeah, actually, this might be a sustainable state of affairs where every 6 months our CEOs get dragged in front of Congress. We yell at them for a little bit. Everybody feels better, and it's cathartic because it's fun to see Mark Zuckerberg sweat on TV. And then we kind of just go back home, right? Because there's actually no broad-based political consensus as to what should come next. And so we're kind of in this weird state where basically tech as a paradigm has lost all credibility, but we're also kind of lacking in what other institutions or ways of thinking, right, will be the kind of consensus way forwards, right? And so I don't know, if to go back to our innovation discussion, it's almost like we're kind of struggling to define a credible other form of innovation, right, that we think we can get behind.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems to me there's a distrust maybe of government as an innovative force, when in fact there are all sorts of examples that I think, or philanthropy, for instance, which would be proof of that.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think this is one of the interesting things is that there's a common framing of startups, of the kind of technology that we've been talking about, which is that VCs are the innovators, right? They take the big risks.
Right.
But I mean, what's really interesting is in the innovation ecosystem, they often just come at the very end when the technology is basically baked to be how do we scale this as a commercial product?
Right, or how do we get a lot of money out of this?
That's correct,
Yeah,
right, exactly.
yeah,
And it actually just turns out that most of the most difficult research took place at a university 40 years ago. Right. And that's actually where a lot of the risk is.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have also misunderstood the risk of innovation and who actually bears that risk, right? I think it is also another part of the debate.
Right. As you're saying that, it reminds me of some ideas happening over more so in Europe about government funding for technologies that eventually become consumer technologies that make a lot of money. I mean, Google was begun from an original grant, I think National Science Foundation, or mRNA vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer actually came out of a lot of funding for the National Institute of Health, and yet the profits are privatized even as the expenses for research are kind of publicly funded. So I guess we get something back as consumers.
Yeah, I mean, you get Twitter.
Yeah, we get Twitter. We get vaccines, but
was it worth it, John?
Yeah. But here's another thought. I mean, innovation. Another way to define innovation is not as a good idea, but as a really good response to a problem. So, when you say that question of okay, where should we go next, or is there a way to design, to prod companies or laboratories as to what new innovations we need or where we should go, or I mean, what are the problems they should be working on? Maybe is a better question, or are they working on good problems, or are they just working on profitable solutions? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my view is, one way of thinking about this is almost generationally, right? Every few decades, society has these big problems they're trying to solve, right? In certain eras, you could argue that actually it's technology that's the really big lever, right? So you're dealing with smallpox, right? Yeah. There's only so much we can do organizationally, legally, societally, to contain this, right? And so it's this era contains a problem where tech is really the strong lever, right? I kind of feel like one of the problems we're having right now is that like we're entering an era where most of society's problems, like tech is no longer the actual most effective lever at dealing with it, but we're sort of just like in this cargo culty way, we're like, just add more technology, like why isn't society being solved? And I think we're just running into a lot of trouble, right? Because when you talk about like, say, issues of escalating inequality, right? Like I think there's a debate as to like, can you tech your way out of that solution, like tech your way out of that problem?
Sure.
And it may just be that like, you know, it's easier to be like, well, maybe we can just tech our way out of the problem because like the alternatives are forms of social innovation which are pretty painful and pretty slow to implement. And this is true of like, say, the disinformation debates, right? Where after 2016, people said, you know, maybe what we should do is just make sure that we implement a system that detects like what's true from what's false, right? And like that's again like kind of teching the solution, right? Like why isn't the tech solving the truth problem, right? But maybe it actually just turns out the truth problem has nothing to do with like what you can do with tech. And so to kind of complete that thought, you know, maybe we're entering an era where like this lever of technology is just like not as effective as, it's not the tool we need to resolve the problems that we have.
Yeah. I also think of climate change as being something where a lot of the technologies to solve it already exist, but it becomes more of a policy and political problem that we're in. So what would be social innovations, what would be political innovations that would say address or better address the inequality issues or better address some of the misinformation, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think they come down to like innovations in governance, right, and innovations in policy. Like I think there is kind of like, you know, it kind of feels like there's this sort of like policy or idea vacuum, right? Certainly in American politics, where it sort of feels like, what's like the policy idea that will kind of like capture an imagination of like a large enough people to create consensus. I think we're missing that in some ways, right? And I think to your point around, say, climate change, right? Like, you know, we have all this technology sitting there. Yeah. Now it's just a question of just like, can you organize people to do it, right? And you know, I think innovations in how you organize people like might look a lot more like, you know, the line you draw on the road than in, you know, like, you know, a new Bitcoin innovation, right? So.
Right. So I mean, I'm going to keep you on that for a second. So how would we organize people if we all, or if Congress, for instance, all agrees, okay, the misinformation is a problem, and this is my subtle way eventually of getting to Twitter, but like, but just assuming that social media is as it is, where Twitter's the public company and Facebook's a kind of public company with Zuckerberg very much in control. I mean, are we, I mean, short of regulation, sort of breaking up these companies, are easy innovations or ideas within our grasp, or is it kind of, or is there always going to be a political problem here?
Yeah, I think there's two sort of responses here. You know, I think at least in the disinformation, misinformation context, right? I think one of the really interesting dilemmas that's kind of playing out right now is, you know, this is sort of remarked in the midst of Trump's deplatforming from all these social media platforms, where people took a look at it and they said, wow, we have really reduced the influence of this political character, right, on our public sphere, right? But people took a step back and said, like, the only reason that worked was because we have these monopolies that are social media platforms that, like, they really can, like, say, we're going to deplatform, and it really has this huge impact. And so I think, at least in the misinformation context, we're, like, trapped in this very difficult dilemma, right, which is basically that, like, concentrations of tech power give us the levers to deal with modifying the public sphere in this way, right? Whereas to decentralize that tech power may actually make it much more difficult to deal with like the kind of public discourse problems, right? So you imagine, okay, we break up these companies and now there's, you know, 1,000 social media platforms, right? With no way to monitor what's happening and no central control to actually influence what's happening on them, right? That ends up being a hard trade-off, right? And I think that ends up being ultimately like kind of should be a political choice, right? Which is basically about like what kind of world do we want to live in with those kinds of hard trade-offs. And again, like, I don't know if this is innovation per se, but it's kind of like, do we feel comfortable with drawing that line? Or is there consensus about where to draw that line?
Right. So Twitter. So Elon Musk says we can change the algorithm or open up, you know, the code. We can do all sorts of things. Maybe that gets back to like that kind of teching the problem perhaps, I don't know. Part of it seems a little bit like that. Let's just change the technology a little bit or tweak the software and then things will be better, or but then again, he's saying, okay, let's just all have more free speech, whatever that means.
Right, yeah. I almost think about this, so this is kind of a weird analogy, but something that's really been on my mind a lot recently, is that there's actually an interesting analogy with like, when we say marketplace of ideas, my mind is like, actually, maybe we can learn a lot from like the history of how we have regulated like financial markets. So that is to say, like, I feel like prior to the Great Depression, there was an idea that you shouldn't intervene in financial markets during a depression or a recession, because that intervention would only make it worse, right? So free markets, you should let things play out and like the market will fix itself, basically. And kind of with the Great Depression, basically economists were like, oh, actually, the problem is that like society can kind of get itself into these kind of like self-reinforcing cycles, and a society can't get itself out of a recession. And so during these periods, basically, we need to have like essentially like supply side stimulus, right? Like we're gonna make money more available, we're gonna do all this fiscal spending. And I kind of feel like, this is sort of the flip, which is basically that Elon Musk and a bunch of other technology people are kind of trapped in like this earlier way of thinking about marketplaces of ideas, right? Where they're basically like, how do we make marketplaces of ideas better? Well, they just need to be more free and less regulated, right? And I think that's not the right approach because it fails to recognize that at certain times, marketplaces of ideas can really kind of be in this kind of like recession scenario, right? Like where there can actually be like problems that like, you really do need to take intervention on. And so I guess my advice, like my thinking in this space is sort of like, maybe we need a kind of like Keynesianism, right? Like maybe we need this kind of approach where we say, okay, can we define the circumstances under which we think like our discourse environment is unhealthy? And like, can we draw lines on when we would actually take action, right? So the really sci-fi version, we would never implement something like this, is like, imagine if Facebook every quarter had to report to the public, like, this is the average amount of polarization happening on the platform. And they would say, if it goes above 10%, like, we're gonna implement a number of changes that have like been debated and negotiated with the public to like bring that number back down again, right? It's like, at least for me, strikes me as like, A, oddly dystopian, but B, maybe a way of kind of balancing these needs, right? To like keep sort of marketplaces of ideas open while sort of making sure that they're kind of like defended against certain sort of like systemic problems we think that might emerge. Yeah. So I don't know, just kind of a weird riff.
No, very, very interesting. I think, as somebody who spent a lot of years studying the phone company, I mean, you can read through these legal hearings over regulation of how the phone company should have been regulated, and there were these, social goals that were implemented, like rural subscribers.
Yeah, universal access, right?
Yeah. Rural subscribers should pay less than urban ones, things like that, or we should have a kind of averaging so that, even people in areas where it's more expensive for the phone company to put access in, they shouldn't have to pay more. So there are all these things. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, totally. And I think like the phone example is a great one because it shows just how mixed up we are about like the metaphors that we're bringing to social media, right? Because it would be weird if like, John, I called you on the phone and I was like, John, let me tell you, like these vaccines, it's a conspiracy from Bill Gates. And like if the phone company just like cut off the call and was like, we just want to let you know that what Tim said is like not a real thing, right? Like that's weird to us because the metaphor of the phone doesn't include like what we bring to social media, right? Which we think about sometimes more as a newspaper, but also sometimes we think about it as the phone. And so the problem is like our predecessor technologies are really making it difficult for us to come up with like consistent policies in the space. But I do think that like, the phone company is also a great example of like places where, society can and should be like, this is what we want the technology to look like. And we're willing to do it even though, we end up with a lot of arguable inefficiencies, right?
Right.
So.
I think that's definitely true. And I think also the question that occurs to me as you're talking, the idea that innovation is sort of by its nature a good thing, that therefore should not be regulated or shouldn't need regulation is somehow gotten hold, I think, or I fear, which is very different than if you went back 50 years and looked at how people complained about the phone company and sort of, wanted it heavily regulated, and eventually to the point where it was broken up. But I fear that we're in a different place now, that we're a lot more maybe tolerant of technology's excesses.
Yeah, the question to you is like, I don't know, I have a good answer to this, is like, why you think that's the case? Like, do you think it's like, this is just the legacy of like deregulation in the 80s, or is it like more than that?
Yeah, I mean, I would posit mistrust of government for some reason, for many reasons, a sort of steady kind of erosion in trust of maybe organizations like the FCC or the SEC. I'm just throwing out that off the top of my head, but I think technology has seemed increasingly miraculous, perhaps, and I feel that way too, and perhaps we've forgotten about that sort of flip side of it. I just throwing these out. How about you?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a clear answer on it. I mean, I do think that I mean, I think we have to put this on the background of I guess this is kind of like an economist hat, right? Is basically the American economy has just been slow growth, right? And one of the small areas that seem to have outsized growth is technology. Mm-hmm. And so there's kind of a hope implicitly, which is to restore the American dynamism after a post-World War II period. We basically just need to give free rein to this thing. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a real question as to whether or not it is the right template, right, for some of the changes that we want to make in society, or the pattern on which we want to advance society.
Sure. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about your career. You worked in Boston, you spent time in Silicon Valley, you spent time in New York. We talked a little bit about innovation, how it differs geographically around the country. And I'm particularly curious about Silicon Valley, your experiences there, and why you didn't stay there and why you came out.
Yeah, I mean, the real reason is that my mom was when are you going to come back to New Jersey? And I was okay, fine. But yeah, I don't know. So I went out there for law school, and it was a fascinating place to be. I do think that there is sort of something there about kind of the ecosystem of a city, and the idea that cities are more interesting if there's a balance of power between different sort of factions within a city, right? Mm-hmm. So that is to say in New York, no one cares that you work on technology, right? Because finance is a way bigger deal. Huh. And in some ways that kind of tempers the expectations and the rhetoric of technology in a way that for me makes it a lot more tolerable, because everybody can kind of look around the table and be yeah, we just spend time trying to figure out how to deliver ads more effectively, right? Versus a world in which it kind of permeates the culture of a city in a way that makes it very difficult to see beyond that, I think.
Right. Was it disillusioning to see some of these tech companies up close, to see it sort of so financially focused, so focused on ads or returns and money, as opposed to sort of big ideas and technology and saving the world or whatever it might be?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I think, again, this all takes place on the background of the years I was there, money was very cheap. Right, and so in some ways it kind of lived in this fantasy world, right? Which is basically we don't need to care about money. We could just talk about changing the world, and you would get odd proposals we should fund a city, right? That's what we should do a startup on.
Meaning create a city.
Yeah, create a city. Yeah, exactly.
So an entire city as an innovative
innovative
project.
Yeah, right. Imagine New York, but as a startup.
Yeah.
Which again, I don't know, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's just imagine.
Would it be one of those bubble cities?
Ideally, it would be a bubble city. Yeah, exactly, with a monorail kind of running through it. It would be, yeah. But I think this is exactly what I'm talking about. Is imagine trying to pitch an investor on the city of New York as a business idea. It would be ridiculous, right? Because you'd be well, I need some money. It's going to take hundreds of years. It's going to burn down several times. But at the end of it, it's going to be one of the most important cities in the world. Right, it just doesn't kind of make sense in that template, right? In some ways.
And so what's preceding that? I mean, my first question is, okay, what problem does that solve? Because there's already cities and there's all kinds of different cities. But then also, is it just? Am I being cynical? Is it just a sort of mercenary play for investment dollars and to make money, or was it somebody who really thought by creating a city from scratch you could avoid all the problems that beset older cities?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the template I always bring to this is there's a very particular community around Bitcoin now that lends the community a very odd kind of flavor, which is a little bit sinister. But you basically have I would say three types of people in the community, right? You've got some people who are basically hey, this is great. A lot of people are just buying this dumb Bitcoin thing. Get in on this, right? So the cynics, right? I think there's some people who are no, this technology is genuinely going to change everything, right? And then there's finally a group which is pragmatists. People are basically well, we're getting money to give money to artists and creators. Isn't that a good thing, right? And like, it's very sometimes difficult to tell like who is who, right? Because the cynics are sometimes pretending to be idealists. The idealists are pretending to be cynics to raise money, right? Like, and so it's like very difficult because like all the motivations are very munged up in a way that I think genuinely makes it difficult, right? Say like in a Silicon Valley context, whatever that means, to basically say like, is it all cynicism or is it all idealism? Is it a mix of both? And I think it's like complex in the way that it is with most things.
Right, right. Did, and of course you worked on AI and machine learning too. This is, maybe you can, I mean, certainly when we talk about sort of the great or most important innovations of now or the next 10 or 20 years, that always comes up. But in the sense that for a lot of us at least, we're not really sure how much it's impacting our lives now because a lot of what's happening is out of sight or on the web. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, what you saw, but also I'm curious about when I talked about innovation or the flip side of innovation, the dangers of innovation, what do you worry about with AI and machine learning? And I don't just mean sort of, I mean economically in terms of jobs perhaps, or all sorts of other sort of security issues too.
Yeah, well, I'll give you like a really crunchy kind of example because I feel like this becomes like very practical very quickly.
Okay.
So there's a problem that computer scientists have been working on for a really long time. It's kind of what they call the problem of like computer vision, right? How do you teach a computer to understand what's in an image? And the way you did it before the current generation in AI was that you basically had a bunch of smart people in a room and they'd be like, how do I try to figure out whether or not like a cat is in a photo? Oh, okay, well a cat's got pointy ears and it has these colors and that's how, and you basically program all these rules into the machine. The current generation of AI is interesting because it basically says, okay, we're not gonna write any explicit rules. What we're gonna do is we're gonna show a computer up thousands, millions of images of cats until the machine basically infers its own rules about whether or not a cat is in an image or not. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that we've discovered is basically that these AI systems are really much better than us at articulating what those rules are in terms of like if a cat is in an image or not. The problem is that we have no idea actually how the machine makes its decision, right? And this is part of the challenge, is like this very interesting trade between like, are you okay with a system that is way better at a task, even though you have a lot less of an understanding of what's going on inside the system?
So in other words, we've created an innovation that we don't even understand how it works.
Correct, right. And so this has very practical implications. So for example, like radiography or like medical diagnosis, right? Which is basically like, we could write a system that has these incredible ability to kind of diagnose someone, right? At the same time, what we're trading is interpretability, the ability to actually understand why the system made the diagnosis that it did, right? And that becomes a very practical trade-off from a public policy standpoint, right? Which is like, are you willing to put this in knowing that you're gonna know less in some ways, right? And I think that that resembles a lot of the challenges that we have in technology frequently, where it's basically this trade-off of like, well, we get a thing, but in some ways we also limit our like understanding of what's going on. And I think, that trade-off is, I think, like a very hard one that we have to confront in a whole number of cases.
Okay. So do we have the either legal or political oversight to sort of manage that kind of?
Sure, yeah.
Manage those dangers?
That's right. I mean, my worry is basically that there's a change of norms on twofold, right? Like, so one way of understanding like what Uber did, right, was you're going to get X amount of money from the VCs, and then you're going to break the law until your company becomes big enough that they can't stop you, basically, right? And like, that's sort of interesting because the business model is like regulatory arbitrage, right? And like in some ways, like the war chest that you raise is the ability for you to break the law long enough that what you're putting out into the world becomes normalized, right? That's pretty worrisome, I think, from like a tech innovation standpoint.
And when you say breaking the law, essentially running taxi services.
Right, in that case, it was basically like taxi cab unions, right?
Right.
Like there's a big game played for a long time, which is like Uber saying, we're not a taxi cab company, we're a transportation network company. Right. And then eventually they were like, wait, you're a taxi cab company. You're like, you got us, but like at this point, we're a huge company, right? And this actually, PayPal did this actually early on, where like the SEC apparently came by and said, are you guys a bank? You guys seem to hold money and allow you to transact money. And they're like, we're definitely not a bank. And then like years later, they were like, wait a minute, you guys are a bank. And it was like too late at that point, right? And I think that is part of the concern, is like how much of this is basically like Silicon Valley or technology in general learning that like humans adjust really quickly to a change that you're making, right? Another kind of like chilling thing that I heard from a product manager, again, at a large tech company was basically like, well, if people are going to just get annoyed at what we're going to do, we're just going to do it anyways, right? Which is basically like, what that says to me is like public discontent is no longer a strong way of shaping the incentives of the company, right? And those are like dangerous developments in any case, right? And I think particularly concerning if you want to go back to the Twitter thing, right? About like what it means that the world's richest man owns this company, right? Also means that like, you know, like the philosophy of basically like saying we're going to make the change, other people are going to deal with it, and that people will get used to it fast enough that it will be okay, becomes an operating manual for some of these places.
Right. So does this in you elicit a kind of, you said worry, I think you said worry. I mean, what do we do? Should we do something? Do we need to do something? Isn't it, if you don't do something, doesn't it just keep getting, it keeps happening, but then it keeps happening on a bigger and bigger scale, I imagine.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think one of the approaches I took, I mean, certainly in this book, right, is basically like that we often, even from a tech critic standpoint, tend to accept a lot of the claims that the tech industry makes as genuine, right? So like everybody, if people remember the Cambridge Analytica, right? So the scandal where basically a bunch of political consultants took a bunch of Facebook data, they did this kind of psychological analysis and they influenced the Brexit vote, right? There was a really fascinating study that came out a few years later from the UK's privacy regulator, which basically says, look, no doubt this was a huge privacy violation, but we can find no data to suggest that any of this data-driven political targeting had any material effect on the election, right? And this is sort of the attack that I take in the book is that a lot of the claims that we make about online advertising, if you look at the data actually it's not actually the case, right? And so I guess to answer your question, like there is something about like lampooning some of these claims, right? And like, you know, showing how hollow some of these claims are that are, I think, critical to like, you know, like kind of like keeping up that psychological barrier, right? That like actually it turns out that you aren't like a philosopher king, you're like just some nerd. So.
Right. I mean, is it possible that some of these disinformation campaigns are less effective at sort of shaping mass public opinion, but can be very dangerous in the sense of inciting individuals to violence?
Yeah, I think this is the really fascinating thing is where I land, having done the research on this book, is that like we may still worry about campaigns of disinformation like what the Russians did in 2016, but it has to rest on more than just the Russians have a mind control array that can influence susceptible Americans, right? Like it may just turn out that like interfering in an election is itself kind of corrosive to democratic institutions, regardless of whether or not you flip enough votes to get one person elected or another. Right. And like that may be the problem, right? More so than like trying to prevent them from like flipping votes, right? Because like a lot of what we know is that stuff is like very ineffectual.
Got it. So, I think we have a few more minutes. Solutions or fixes, innovative fixes. I mean, I think I always say that one innovation solves one problem as it creates another, and it seems that we're in that sphere, especially with Facebook or social media. Is it that do we have to look outside of tech, as you said, to fix tech? If we acknowledge it's broken, or take me in the direction you'd want to take
I mean, I think we're basically on the hunt for like better institutions, I would say, right? Like that's kind of where I'd put some of this issue, right? Is like, I think one of the reasons that, so some of you may have heard that Facebook basically put together what's in effect like a Supreme Court, right, to do their content moderation. And it's an effort to basically be like, we're going to create these like third parties that will kind of arbitrate particular issues on the platform, right? And I think one of the responses to this is like, wow, we've gone really far down this path, right? Where we feel like none of the other institutions in society can solve these problems. And so the way to solve it is to like build this proto-Supreme Court into Facebook, right? I think that's kind of an indication that like we have this weird vacuum of other institutions in society that can like be kind of like credible, representative, trusted, all these sorts of things. And so I think we're like kind of desperately in need of that, right? Like one of the interesting stories I'm following right now is all of the worker organizing against the Amazon, right? And like it's interesting to me that like a lot of the traditional union infrastructure failed to create like to win those union votes. And it basically took like a completely separate union to like win, right, the first vote. And I think that's, again, kind of indicative is basically like, well, maybe we have to recreate some of these institutions, but like it does feel like we're in the mode now to be like, we're building new civil institutions that will have the kind of credibility to be like, okay, here's an alternative. Like you don't have to build the Supreme Court in the Facebook. Like there's this other thing that we think is like potentially a lot more accountable that like we would want to put our social capital into, right? And I think that's kind of, you know, as we think about solutions, I think that's like one of the really key things.
How about government regulatory agencies like the FCC or the or the FTC? Are they just hopelessly antiquated? Have they kept up with technology and innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain things that government just has the ability to solve. The question is whether or not government gets around to doing it, right? Like the FTC has the power to do a lot of really big moves in the space, but you know, it's also hampered by the fact that its delegation of authority from Congress is like very vague. And there's always the worry that if they go too aggressive, eventually there'll be an attempt to kind of rein them back, right? And I think that's kind of part of the problem is that we have like a lot of these instruments, and you know, there was almost a vision, I think, in the early days of the web, which is basically that like eventually government and companies could all be replaced by like, you know, masses of people kind of self-organizing online. But I do think, you know, there is a role for government. I think it's just a question of just like how it does that. Right. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a hypothetical. So you're named innovation czar by some president at some point. And what problems do you fix? How do you direct monies? What are the top 3 things you would do?
I mean, maybe I'd actually resign immediately, because I feel like one of the things I'd like to get across with this conversation is that like innovation just may be the wrong paradigm with which to think about some of these problems. Like the question is like, if we're really worried about inequality in society, you don't need an innovation czar. Like maybe we should get people who actually study that problem to figure it out. And so like the munging of all these problems together as innovation problems may itself be kind of the meta category problem that we're making, right? Yeah.
Right. But then again, we also did talk a little bit about how policy can't be innovative. I mean, there's always good ideas out there. They're not making it doesn't feel like they're making their way to Washington, or maybe they're not getting passed into law. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, the pessimist view is basically like maybe we're just entering an era where society is sufficiently fragmented that basically like national level politics is like almost like doesn't make any sense anymore, right? You know, it's kind of a disappointing outcome, but then what you'd say is like most of the change is happening like on these like ultra local levels, right? Which again, like I think is like maybe sort of like the painful outcome that we end up with, right? Is like it's really hard to fix things on the state level. It's really hard. It's even harder to fix things on the national level. So maybe the best we can do for now until sort of like the pendulum swings is to kind of like organize at like the super local level. I don't know, I want to believe that we can kind of like do better than that, right? But it does kind of feel like there are a bunch of like structural issues that are kind of like pushing us in that direction over time.
Okay, got it. Just a couple of quick things about some of the big tech companies. I mean, is there an analog historically for how much power is concentrated in their hands as you see it? If we're depending on them for the cargo to be delivered regularly and give us, you know, new devices, new processes, improvements in our life, is there far too much power that those companies hold at the moment? I mean, is the idea of the Silicon Valley garage startup just hopelessly impossible now because they'll just get gobbled up by some bigger companies?
Yeah, I mean, I guess competition is always fierce, but I do think that. Yeah, I think that's generally right. As I guess I'd agree with that view. Yeah.
And the billionaire sort of.
Well, that's what I mean. Is like I feel like that there is actually a lot of historical precedent here, right? That like I think in fact to think about these things as an entirely new class of power may be incorrect, right? Which is like, you know, like I think like a railroad baron in the 19th century actually has a lot to teach us, right? In that they like control a supply network, right? That like has the ability to influence the rise and fall of like, you know, like governments, right? That has kind of an unaccountable amount of wealth, right? And there's a story there about like how we kind of like brought that to heel in some ways. And so I think like there is kind of a long legacy of you know, this, and I think we should kind of just see this as like the next generation in some ways.
Right. Does that give, as a last question, does that give you a sense of optimism, for instance, that we did at one point in our history sort of address both these great inequalities as well as these sort of impossibly rich and powerful barons of companies that controlled all sorts of other means of production, that we will do it again, or are we at risk of not repeating
Yeah, I mean, again,
the good parts of history?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no historical inevitabilities, right? But it does give me optimism that there's an opening, right? That like these things aren't kind of like terminally broken. And so, yeah, I think it gives me optimism.
Okay. And just, you mentioned Facebook's sort of inner sanctum or Supreme Court. Are there other things you might point to where things that give you sort of a sense that they can get better, or that serve as models?
It can get worse, or
Can get better, actually.
Oh, can get better. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know if the Supreme Court is actually an example of getting better, right? It's things are getting weirder,
right?
Of which I think like the Musk thing is like, I don't know, things are getting weirder. That's like the main thing I can tell you. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I do think that is quite interesting is actually like organizing that's happening within these companies, which is actually a really interesting part of the battle and the debate, right? Like, so in the AI space, right, like it turned out that there was like a handful of really key machine learning researchers that were like, we're not going to work on military applications. And it really was like a big problem for Google, right? And so I do think that like there is some promise there as well, which is like, is there like a moral conscience of people who work in these industries, right? Like that can also play a role like on the inside in terms of like causing trouble in the very least, but in the best case, like actually changing where the policy is going.
Okay, right. And I mean, there's an analog to that certainly with scientists working on nuclear weapons in the 50s and 60s and saying we should get out of that too. Are there any things, I know we're sort of at the end of things, is that right, Sarah?
I have time for one more question.
Okay.
And then we should open it up to,
Sure, sure. Just a quick question about our general expectations or public expectations of technology. Should we temper them? Or are they just too large? Do we just, we talked about how we sort of keep expecting these tech fixes, but how do we temper our expectations? If we're not hoping for new technology, what do we hope for? Or should we not hope? Should we act?
Yeah, and I think this is again like a little bit, it goes to kind of constantly reacquainting ourselves with how broken everything is. Right, where like you have the dream of the self-driving car. It actually turns out that like it's really bad at recognizing pedestrians, right? Like, you know, you have the dream of Bitcoin, right? But it actually turns out that like if you just need to go buy a sandwich, it's like really, really difficult to buy a sandwich with Bitcoin, right? Like in some ways, like the greatest promise of our like kind of technological innovation frequently is just like kind of disappointing when you encounter it. And I think like that sort of loop of being like, this is what I was promised, this is what I got. Like I think is like actually like a pretty powerful, I think, like personal practice, I think, in thinking about how we temper our expectations.
Right. Now, of course, to bring this full circle, that you're sort of paraphrasing what Peter Thiel, the famous VC, said about Twitter. You know, we wanted flying cars, but we got whatever number,
right.
144
exactly.
characters. So now, of course, his old partner Elon Musk is buying it because it's so great.
Right. When it's particularly difficult because like a lot of the most humdrum stuff is the stuff that ends up being like making the biggest difference. And I think that also is, I think, something that's really fascinating to me is like the degree to which like technology, once it sort of solves the problem, sort of like doesn't become technology anymore. It's just sort of like infrastructure.
Sure.
Right?
Like that white line on the road, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Or like, I don't know, like lights and like hot water to your house. Right?
Sure,
yeah.
sure. All those things. Well, thank you. Really interesting. I hope we didn't get too techy, but.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. So, anybody, Mark?
I just had kind of a comment that I thought might be useful. You guys were talking about innovation, but I think the term which kind of brings together a lot of what you guys were speaking about was disruption. I mean, the mantra became disruption, which was to suggest that the new technology overturned the archaic and was always better because it broke what had become useless, such as, for example, government. And now what you would believe in is the next disruption. And that, to me, is questionable. Is it necessarily so that disruption brings something better?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I don't think we should think about it as like linear progress, right? With like disruptions leading to like better disruptions that lead to like the best disruption at some point. I do think one of the things that's really amusing is the degree to which like once tech companies become established, they sort of like reproduce all the old models, right? So you may have seen that like Amazon is like opening up physical stores again, right? Which is like, I think is like a really interesting outcome, right? And like Uber is like teaming up with taxi cab companies, right? Like, and like reworking under like the taxi cab medallion system. And so there's kind of this basically like your today's disruptor is just tomorrow's like the same old basically in some ways. And like that reproduction I think is like kind of very funny to me, you know? There was a company, a very short-lived startup for a while that was basically like, what if there were like these small stores on the corners in cities that would sell you like all sorts of like, you know, like a sandwich and like maybe some gum and candy, and people were like, you reinvented the bodega, like a store that no one wants you to replace. And again, I think that's also kind of a funny thing. Me and my friends have this game where you try to pitch a startup, but you're just pitching something normal like a bar of soap. Yeah. But the idea is to pitch it in like, you know, once everybody uses this like soap, it's going to be, you know, exponential growth, and like, and you can often make really kind of normal things sound quite valuable. So.
There was a product that I think VCs were funding for millions of dollars called, I think, the Juicero. It was a juicer, you know, and it was tens of millions of dollars in backing, and it completely collapsed. You know, it was just a juicer. I think
it was a locked system too. You had to buy their juice to use in their juice. I've been trying to get one on eBay. It's like surprisingly difficult.
That's great. But Mark, I mean, the question about incremental innovation and disruptive innovation, I mean, disruptive, these are buzzwords, but right. Sometimes it's called discontinuous innovation. I mean, yeah, I think it was a big mistake, and still is a big mistake to think necessarily that a disruptive innovation is better than an incremental innovation. And we might just think of something like the solar cell or solar panels. You know, to begin with, it was a tremendous invention, discontinuous, I guess, innovation. But really, you know, solar power became useful because of all these incremental innovations over the course of really almost 65 years. So, you know, they're both necessary, and they're both, you know, vital to sort of making products and tech products better and probably policy better. But yeah, it's a way that I think, as Tim captured, if you really make something sound exciting and something that will create upheaval and thrills, disruption, it's a bigger deal.
Yeah, in the back. Okay. I actually work in this industry, so this is kind of interesting to me. I actually started the day at a session with an analytics company. We were talking about artificial intelligence. Anyway, but I want to follow up on the last question, that is all disruption good. Has Silicon Valley gotten too big to fail?
I mean, in some ways, I was at a really interesting, and again, also kind of like chilling meeting, like shortly before I left San Francisco, where, you know, basically a startup was arguing to basically a policymaker, saying like, no, you don't want to regulate Silicon Valley because you wouldn't want China to win, now would you? And I think that like ultimately is like a really potent political argument at this moment in time, which is basically like, don't touch the golden goose because of broader kind of geopolitical competitiveness issues. Right. And of course the response to this is like, look, we can ensure you're accountable and still win the tech battle. But I do think that like rhetoric like that is one that I think will work, right? Like I think it will create like a shielding that kind of creates this almost too big to fail feeling, right? Which is like, we have to let them kind of run because like to do otherwise would, you know, set us into a low growth, you know, economy with all the kind of problems that would come into.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, so a lot of the regulation is on content for the most part. Has there been much on the algorithm?
Less so, and I think in part it's because of like the relative knowledge of a lot of kind of like legislator staffs on like, it's easier to be like, we don't want you to spread this content, but a lot more difficult to be like, well, we think like your algorithm is sorting this content in the wrong way. And I think, so we haven't seen as much of that. I know in Europe there is some work on basically ensuring like disclosures about how algorithms make decisions in certain types of contexts. Mm-hmm. And so we're starting to see that in Europe, but at least in the US, I don't know of any like particularly strong kind of attempt at that, right? Like I think the standout example that we still have is a historical one, which is credit scoring, right? Mm-hmm. So.
Sure, and some, I guess some of the ideas with a new and improved Twitter would be that the content would be there, but the algorithm would be tweakable so mm-hmm. that you wouldn't get the content that you found objectionable or something like that. But.
Yeah, and I think that's an approach. And again, we're talking about trade-offs, right? Which is basically like, do we think that people doing that tends to increase polarization or decrease polarization, right? Like I would say, well, probably increase, but like we also have greater autonomy, right, under that sort of regime, right? And it's a hard trade-off, right? Which one do you want, right?
Right. Interesting. Great.
Yeah, sure.
So there's certainly no shortage of examples where technology is disconcerting, it can go off track. I think of deep fakes, I think of AI that's run amok, etc. But one in particular, I think that's just so disturbing is the merit system that I understand is being implemented throughout several cities in China, where facial recognition will link social etiquette to whether they're doing good things or bad things, jaywalking, littering, not paying their bills. And you get points deducted for being a problem, and you get points added back on for maybe turning in your neighbor for not doing his taxes or so. And I guess the engineering end of this whole thing ends up where the individual who might be in deficit and a problem to society is shown up on movie screens, and their cell phone outbound calls are intercepted with a voice message from the government saying, listen, the guy who's calling you now has not paid his bills or what happened, a whole bunch of things. Please comment on that.
This is actually a fascinating example. I have a friend who actually like studies what you're talking about, which is this sort of like social credit scoring system in China. And what's really interesting is that at least her conclusion is basically that it is kind of deeply dystopian, but not in the ways that we usually think. And like very connected to the discussion that we just had, right? Which is we have a dream of like very Black Mirror, right? Like it sees all, it gives you a score, and you're totally kind of within this regime. Mm-hmm. It actually turns out that like when you actually talk to like people's lived experience of this system on the ground, it's like broken all the time, right? Like, and it actually turns out that frequently it's just a way for like sort of mid-level bureaucrats to exert kind of arbitrary power over people, right? Because the system actually is like, the data is not very well put together, the surveillance is not very perfect. And so what ends up happening is basically that you don't necessarily have like, 1984, but you have something almost as dystopian, which is like essentially like a partial surveillance system, which is arbitrarily implemented and is largely like a cover for sort of like incompetent government bureaucrats. And like I think is a great example of basically like we're sold this vision of the power of the technology for good or for ill, when it turns out that a lot of the problems are actually a lot more basic in some sense, right? Mm-hmm. And so, again, this is not to say that China's never going to like converge to what you're discussing, but I think the reality on the ground is kind of like it's bad, but maybe like not necessarily from the technology, but more like sort of the power structures that are underneath it. Mm-hmm.
Just wondered about, as the next disruptor, climate change, and obviously tech is very involved in that, but I always think there's also more just typical like logistic issues, which of course would bring in technology, but where do you see it going with climate change, with tech, or not, or more than what I actually.
Yeah, I have this weird friend who works on the emerging field of what he calls geoengineering, which is like this kind of wild idea, which is basically like, well, if things get really bad, what we need to do is have a bunch of ships that sail around the world continuously and release aerosols into the air in a way that changes the atmosphere in a way that allows the atmosphere to be cooled, right? And like, I'm like, this is a pretty wild thing to be spending your time on trying to raise money around. And he's basically like, I have no faith that we're ever going to solve the problem fast enough that eventually these crisis solutions will become necessary, which is like, again, kind of dystopian and sort of scary. But I think that's kind of where we find ourselves with things like climate change, right? Is like, there's kind of a worry that like, it feels like every year it's basically like, sort of like getting worse, not making enough changes, getting worse, not making enough changes. And like technology will be brought in to tech the problem, but like what that entails will be kind of really, really, really painful, right? And I think that that's kind of unfortunately where we're ending up if we can't sort of solve like the deeper kind of political issue, which again, I'm not directly involved in climate, but a lot of my friends who are like kind of like at the end of their rope on. I know this is more your space, so.
Yeah, no, I do write about it a lot. I mean, I think, we do have a lot of the technologies at hand that could make a tremendous difference, and we could shut down coal plants all around the world and make a tremendous difference. We could add incentives for electric cars dramatically to sort of for trade-ins for older. We could do tremendous things, and they're not necessarily technological fixes, or they utilize the technologies we have already, and we're not doing it, or we're doing it at a pace that's slow enough so that things remain really worrisome to the point where we won't really reach the goals we need to reach. So yeah, so then other fixes or possible things that buy us more time, like geoengineering or carbon removal, which can involve machines or other burying carbon dioxide underneath, become a bit more necessary, maybe. I guess the bigger picture is that I write about climate change a lot, and I don't necessarily sort of worry too much that we don't have the technology. I just worry that we can't really agree to make dramatic policy moves, not just nationally, but globally, and get ourselves off fossil fuels quick enough. And at the moment, we're not even close to doing that. Sorry, everybody.
One last question.
Sure, go ahead.
I have a question about your current company, Substack, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about Substack, and I would love to know, do you see it as complementary to the traditional publishing industry and structures, or do you see it as standing apart from it in some way?
Yeah. So I kind of put it in the context of, I guess the thing that I bring to it is always like what I would call like the psychological price of content, right? Which is basically like for, most of the recent history of the web, like the psychological price of content for almost everything has been zero, right? Because it's all been ad driven, right? And that has made it really, really difficult to kind of like create sort of like media ecosystems where people are sort of willing to like pay for content, right? And I think that has created a bunch of like attendant problems, right? Like I do believe that like an ad-driven ecosystem, for example, like basically causes us to like create experiences where it's like, we need you to scroll all the time, right? Because basically if you scroll all the time, we can deliver more ads, right? And so I think there's all these kind of problems that have emerged out of sort of like an ad-driven web that I see sort of Substack as attempting to kind of like shift to the norms on, right? And the shift in norms is in some ways like not anything like super mind-blowing, right? It's simply to say like, could we convince you to take money out of your pocket and pay for content? But I think that basically has like potentially a spillover effect where like the norm becomes when I encounter a piece of content online, I'm like willing to pay for it. And that I think like totally changes a lot of the dynamics of the media industry. Because suddenly, you have like media outlets that are not dependent on ads or third parties and may not even dependent on traffic, right, to like make a living. And so I guess in some ways this is, again, like new, very much similar to the old, right, is like if we can really rebuild that norm, then like, yeah, maybe someone can make a living just like selling a newsletter that they do on the side. And I think personally that's really exciting, even though like to hear it, you're like, oh yeah, this is just like pamphleteering in the 1700s. But like I do think that like it would represent a sort of a return to how things used to be, but also kind of like a fundamental change to the way the media is right now. And so that's how I kind of see the project of the company is sort of like shifting that norm about the price that people think of when they say, this is someone who has written something. Like I would want to live in a world where people say, and then I'm going to spend money to help support them. So.
Sure. And just for people who don't, these are generally writers or thinkers delivering weekly newsletters or sometimes daily?
Weekly newsletters, yeah. I mean, the most exciting kind of writer I think on the platform is one that is not like a professional journalist. Like we've had several like professors who are just like publishing newsletters now that are making like millions of dollars on their newsletter. Huh. And it's just great because you're basically like creating, you're unlocking kind of like a whole other population of writers that might not otherwise be able to make a living on doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, good. I hope that was okay.
Yeah.
We didn't get